I'd like to welcome everybody to this webinar from the American Nuclear Society's Risk-Informed Performance-Based Principles and Policy Committee, RP3C we call it. My name is Prasad Kadambi and I am chair of RP3C. The purpose of RP3C is to help modernize ANS standards. Modernization has come to mean that risk-informed and performance-based methods are employed to overcome the difficulties that we all know about from purely deterministic and prescriptive methods. We've been calling these methods RIPB approaches. And this term, risk-informed performance-based, has found a place in the statute in the Nuclear Energy Innovation and Modernization Act.
Did you hit this up, Daddy? No, right?
Okay. Let's see, somebody's not on mute, if you don't mind. There is a lot of guidance available on RIPB approaches, but most people have not had reason to become familiar with the guidance because the conventional approaches still dominate most things that we do, including standards development. Right now, ANS can be considered as a knowledge center for RIPB with all the collection of a community of practice sessions that we have on the RP3C webpage of the ANS website. RP3C initiated these community of practice webinars on RIPB to enable practitioners of RIPB approaches to share their knowledge and experience. We have generally scheduled these on the last Friday of every month. This month is an exception because the last Friday falls on Thanksgiving weekend. I'm very appreciative that Kyle Metzroth of representing X Energy has agreed to speak about the experience and knowledge that X Energy has developed as a result of using RIPB methods. And he will talk about this in the context of the NEI 1804 document that NRC has actually endorsed in a regulatory guide. So Kyle, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Prasad. Just to confirm, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Perfect, thanks. Well, thanks everybody for joining today and to this talk. My name is Kyle Metzroth. I work for NPR Associates, but I've been working with X Energy over the past year, supporting them as their implementation lead for the NEI 1804 process. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is a little bit about the experience that we've had in implementing the process and some lessons learned. To give you a little bit of idea of what my role actually is I would say I play sort of an integrating or interfacing role between the various groups within X Energy, trying to bridge the design organization, safety analysis, PRA, and licensing organizations, and sort of driving the implementation of the process, making sure all those groups are conversing with one another, all the insights are shared, etc. So with that, I'll get into it. My background, just for those, I'm new to this particular community. So I have some PRA background. My PhD dissertation was actually in dynamic PRA methods. I haven't practiced PRA methods much since that time. I've done mostly safety analysis work, some for the US Navy. I worked in the design of the Columbia class and Virginia class submarines. And since my time at NPR, I've done mostly nuclear safety work. So I would say in all of the various elements of NEI 1804, I wouldn't call myself an expert in each individual one. We have a team of experts that help to implement the various pieces, but sufficiently dangerous in each, I suppose. So to give a little bit of background on the Xe-100 design itself, for those who may not be aware. So the Xe-100 is a pebble bed modular reactor design utilizing TRISO fuel. So a depiction of the design and its current concept is here on the right-hand side. So we have the pebble bed core where pebbles flow in from the top down through the bottom through a fuel handling system and then are recycled back up to the top. The core is downflow, so helium enters the core from the steam generator up along the graphite reflector over in this direction and then turns down. The flow goes down through and then over through a cross vessel and then into a helical coil steam generator. There are two helium circulators driving the motion of helium through the core. The safety case for the Xe-100 is, similar to that for many other past HTGR designs. The main safety case lies with the fuel and maintaining temperatures less than the point where the fuel begins to see issues. So the Xe-100 design utilizes the UCO TRISO design. The fuel's been tested up to 1800 C, very high, very good performance up into those temperatures. So the reactor has the ability to remove all of its decay heat away passively, right? So no active cooling systems are required. And so again, the majority of the safety case rests in the fuel, the ability to conduct the ground, and the inherent safety of the plant itself. And so, given these inherent safety features, the X-Energy team, is strongly leveraging risk-informed performance-based methods to be able to take advantages of that inherent safety. We don't need a substantial amount of active systems to be able to perform during any design basis accident scenarios. And so really leveraging that inherent safety, to have a cost-effective design. So NEI 1804. So X-Energy is committed to utilizing the NEI 1804 process. It's a risk-informed, performance-based process really focused on non-light water advanced reactors. And the key aspects of the process are that it helps with selecting licensing basis events, classifying structures, systems, and components, and also has a holistic evaluation of defense in depth. As many people are probably aware, and I don't know the full background of everyone on this call, so I will be going into some explanatory details about the NEI 1804 process just to make sure everyone's on the same page. But I don't consider this an NEI 1804 tutorial, just enough to at least provide context to the things that we're doing. So as many people are probably aware, with the existing light water fleet, a lot of the accident cases that we look at, design bases, have been built up over the course of years of experience. And we don't necessarily have all that for advanced reactors, and nor do we want to live to the same standard. So, the 1804 process allows you to leverage the PRA to be able to build those licensing events and leverage the importance of various SSCs to risk and nuclear safety to be able to classify the structure, systems, and components, accordingly. And using an early version of this process that we'll be going through today, X-Energy is taken apart in what's known as the Licensing Modernization Project, which I think probably many people on the call are aware of. There were several advanced reactor companies that went through an early stage of the process to demonstrate its capabilities. And as a matter of fact, a lot of what I'll be talking about today is going to use that as an example. We've gone much farther than that since then, but just since this information is currently publicly available, I'll be using it as sort of a backdrop for the conversation. So X-Energy participated in this pilot. We actually leveraged a lot of the information that was gained from it to help inform the design, and I'll be discussing that a little bit. For those who may not be aware, this is a reference to the NEI 1804 document. And as Prasad mentioned at the beginning of the discussion, that the NRC has endorsed NEI 1804 as a risk-informed method for forming the licensing basis of advanced reactors, with some clarifications, but largely have adopted the guidance in the document. And as I mentioned, we're committed to following this approach because we see it as a way to maintain high levels of inherent safety, but at the same time, balancing cost as well. So I want to get into now a little bit of how we've implemented NEI 1804. So I'm limited to some degree on things that we can talk about at the time, just because of proprietary information. But what I'm going to try to do is, as I mentioned before, we're going to use the licensing modernization program, which I'll refer to as LMP. LMP pilot that was performed as sort of the backdrop to talk about it. But I'll talk a little bit more in more depth about some of the things that we've learned, some of the processes we've put in place, et cetera. So we'll use that as the discussion point. So, and the way that I'm going to structure this is walk through the three main elements of NEI 1804 and talk a little bit about, how we've implemented it and what we've learned from it. So again, the three major elements are the selection of licensing basis events, the classifications of structure, systems, and components, and the evaluation of defense in depth. So we'll start a little bit with licensing basis events. So the picture that you see here comes from what we know as our phase 0 PRA. It was an initial PRA that was performed for the preconceptual Xe-100 design. And on the right-hand side here is the LMP frequency consequence target. It's the same thing that's in the NEI 1804 process. So for those who aren't familiar, this frequency consequence curve really serves as the target that you're seeking to stay less than. We're on the y-axis is the event sequence frequency, and on the x-axis is the total effective dose equivalent at the exclusion area boundary. And each one of these dots on the FC chart, represents, a sequence on the PRA, right? So you take the sequence frequencies and their associated consequences, plot them here, and see how well you compare to the chart. There's another line that is not shown directly here. It's the risk significance line, which is 2 orders of magnitude lower than this, which represents when you have risk significant sequences. And one of the things you can clearly see from the initial results that we had was that, the safety case for the Xe-100 is very good. There's large margins to the target and even large margins to the frequency consequence, to the risk significance line, which is again 2 orders of magnitude lower than this. With respect to going through the generation of licensing basis events, I would say it's, nothing terribly controversial. I mean, it's you have the plant design evolves. We're following the ASME non-light water reactor PRA standard, and building the event sequences based on the information available to us. But even in this original state, I mean, the original phase 0 PRA that was developed was, I would say it was based a lot on past HTGR designs with insights from the Xe-100. But even with that, at that design stage, and using that initial information, there were a lot of insights that could be gained from the PRA. As a matter of fact, that was one of the things that helped to select the use of 2 circulators for the design, and also inside the steam generator, the helical coil steam generator, there are two bundles. And part of the reasons for that were for trying to put sequences where you lost forced circulation out of the AOO region. And the AOO region is defined as the region frequency above 10 to the minus 2 per plant year, the DBE region between 10 to the minus 2 and 10 to the minus 4, and the BDBE region less than 10 to the minus 4 per plant year. And so there were even with, I would say, taking the compendium of knowledge from HTGRs and sort of making a more generic PRA, we were able to leverage that information to make some very important early on insights. As the design and the PRA have continued to mature, and they've continued to mature substantially, I would say one of the major factors that I think we've found in implementing this process, that's a key challenge, is making sure you stay in lockstep with the design. The design evolves very quickly in these stages during the conceptual and preliminary design stage, and I would say sort of at the beginning, it's really, what we found is it's really important to set up clear communication between the PRA and licensing teams and the design teams to make sure that PRA information is communicated, it's communicated in the right way, and that information can then be taken and fed back into the design. But I would say that the design insights that have been coming out of the PRA have been very well received and are very well embraced by the design organization. I would say they're sometimes almost hungry for it. I think that, people are really very interested to make sure they understand all the key considerations they have to make in their design. I think we find good exchange of information. One of the things that we did very early on in the process to try to help educate people on the PRA, what you could learn from it, et cetera, because, a lot of the people that are working in the design organization don't have a PRA background. Is that, we held sessions with the engineering team, reviewing with them this, at least at the beginning, this initial phase 0 PRA, describing the major events, what their importances were, getting feedback from them on differences in the design they were thinking relative to what was assumed in the PRA, and really served to have some really good integration and communication. So, having those kinds of interactions we found to be, really quite useful. And I would say almost especially at the beginning of this process, one of the things that this does is it also just serves as a knowledge management tool, because if you think about the PRA, there's a lot of information heavily condensed and packed inside there regarding the safety case of these kinds of plants. And it actually served as a training tool to help people better understand the safety case of the reactor and what's important. So again, this initial PRA that, again, wasn't, I would say, very heavily informed by a very specific Xe-100 design, but the designs upon which it's based, served a very valuable purpose in informing the design, as well as helping to as a conversation starter with the design organization. So again, the PRA that was developed, and then it has continued to be furthered. And at the time when the initial phase 0 PRA was developed, there were 62 licensing basis events that were identified, so 62 scenarios on the event tree, and several different initiating events that were evaluated that I would say are fairly typical for gas reactor designs. So just various trip scenarios, turbine trip, reactor trip, circulator trip, loss of flows, control rod withdrawal accidents, loss of offsite power, loss of feed water, depressurization events of various sizes, and steam generator tube rupture. As the design has evolved and the PRA has evolved, one of the things that we're starting to factor in more are things like support systems. So these events, I would say, are really very, primary system and secondary system focused, but obviously there's a lot of support systems which feed these. And I think we're seeing some insights that's very similar to the kinds of insights that light water reactors saw when they looked at the initial PRAs and saw the importance of things like component cooling water and service water, right? So those, understanding the relative importance, the risk of those support systems is starting to become an important factor to us. Now, again, I say importance to risk, and when the overall risk is very low. So I'm speaking on a relative basis, but we're starting to get a better idea of how those systems, are important to safety as we get deeper into the PRA and start building out a PRA that's more Xe-100 specific and goes deeper down into the systems. And some initial insights also that came out of the PRA is, I mentioned that there were some design decisions that were made at the beginning to try to limit the number of sequences where you were relying on passive cooling, try to maintain active cooling in the AOO region as more of a defense in depth philosophy. And I would say when this initial PRA was developed, and even some more recent work, we identified some scenarios where that was not happening to the degree we wanted it to. Now the plant can obviously rely only on passive cool down. We don't need the active systems. We just don't want to be relying on it all the time, right? You don't want to be relying on passive cool down. Your temperatures, get much higher. You'd rather not be cycling the plant that much. It's a lot harder to get the plant restarted if you need to. So there's just a lot of benefits for staying on active cooling. And the PRA was helped to identify that. And it's also helped to communicate with the design team, what design requirements are going to be necessary for various systems in order to be able to, meet the targets that we were trying to achieve. So we found, I would say that we've utilized PRA, I think, very heavily during the design process to provide feedback into the design, and the system engineering team is reaching out to us quite a bit to understand, what's the PRA saying and what are the insights that they're telling us. So I think over time we've gotten a lot of really good integration, developed a culture of people who understand that this process can really give them the insights that they need. And from the licensing basis events, there are sort of two pieces to the overall process, right? The LBEs, tell you sort of the PRA story, and how you compare on the frequency consequence curve. But there's a deterministic side of this, and that's the development of design basis accidents. And for those who aren't aware, so design basis accidents are something that you derive from event sequences in the design basis event region. So if you look at, the sequences here, this is the DBE region between 10 to the -2 and 10 to the -4 per plant year. You take those sequences and you develop design basis accidents by crediting only safety related SSCs, right? So and I'll talk a little bit about, our initial assumptions on what those systems are in just a moment. But you only credit safety related SSCs, and then you run accident cases that include the typical deterministic penalties, treatment of uncertainties, etc. They go in with that. And I would say one thing that's been interesting is that concept confuses a lot of people. When you talking about LBEs and DBAs, and especially when you start saying DBEs and DBAs, and the different assumptions that go into them and what they mean, right? Because the DBAs are meant to be compared against regulatory dose limits, whereas the LBEs really help to inform you on your classifications. People really struggle with that. And I think, I've had to explain that numerous times, and I very possibly could be explaining it badly, but trying to help people understand the distinction there and why one or the other is important, I think has been an important lesson for me, and how to communicate this to those who aren't necessarily practitioners in this kind of thing all the time. What I've sort of said so far is really related, I would say, to the PRA side of things. So the development of the event sequences and the initiating events. But there's also, the dose consequence piece to it. And, in the initial phase 0 PRA that was developed, we initially just utilized scaled consequences from past HTGR designs to make estimates on the consequences. But more recently, we've been developing more detailed mechanistic source term evaluations that are Xe-100 specific. And X-Energy has developed an integrated suite of codes known as XS term to model all of the various phenomena that are important in an HTGR design, and to be able to capture those in the LBE evaluations. Because in the LBEs, we want to try to treat the physics as best as we possibly can without dealing with conservatisms. And we really need a good mechanistic source term evaluation tool in order to be able to do that. So to give you an idea of the various physics that the tool was handling, and again, don't know everyone's background, so I'll briefly just kind of go over the key aspects of the the HTGR mechanistic source term case. So the major safety case in the HTGRs is the triso fuel, where most of the fission products are retained inside the kernel and within the silicon carbide layer that acts as the pressure vessel. And as part of the Xe-100 design, even for our worst accidents, we don't expect, any significant and potentially any real particle failures to occur in service during an accident scenario. So really the source term is related to only those particles that were initially failed because of the fuel fabrication specification. There's intrinsically failed particles, as well as heavy metal contamination that can be outside of the particle itself. And so so we have the XS term code can model the diffusion of fission products out of the kernels for those failed particles, the diffusion of heavy metal contamination, the diffusion from the graphite pebbles and release into the helium pressure boundary, the subsequent circulating and deposition and liftoff inside the pressure boundary, and then in the event of a depressurization, the ability to track the radionuclides as they go out into the reactor building and then out into the environment. And there are also mechanisms inside the tool set to be able to handle moisture ingress and air ingress effects as well, such as wash off, steam off, and other oxidation effects that can occur. So, as part of the excess term evaluation, we evaluate the TRISO fuel release, we can evaluate the fuel pebble release from the pressure boundary in the building in order to evaluate those consequences. And so we don't necessarily do this for every event sequence. It's a lot of physics to be calculating, and so we run it for a family. We run some cases on a family of event sequences, but we can go evaluate the specific mechanistic source term for each scenario that we need to cover. Sorry, is there a question? Was that somebody just off mute? I'll keep going.
I think we are hoping that people who have questions will use the chat function while you're speaking.
Okay. Okay, so I'll move on next to the next piece of the process, and that's the classification of SSCs. So at a high level, NEI 1804 has 3 different classifications in it. That's classifying as safety related, as non-safety related with special treatment applied, and then non-safety related but with no special treatment. And there's a process inside NEI 1804 for what leads you to those various classifications. And for the safety related piece, it's really about those SSCs that are needed in order to meet your required safety functions. And I'll describe that in a moment. That's described by this tree over here. What are the minimal functions that you need in order to ensure that you meet your offsite dose limits? For non-safety related with special treatment, which I'll refer to as NSRST, there are really 2 ways that you get there. One is by the SSCs being risk significant, so contributing overall to one of the quantitative risk metrics to some appreciable fraction. And the other is through SSCs that are necessary to ensure adequate defense in depth. So I'll talk a little bit about the safety related systems first, and then I'll talk about the process for selecting NSRST. So as part of, again, what I'm showing here on the left hand side is comes from the LMP pilot that X-Energy took part in, and this has evolved some as our knowledge of our particular design has also evolved. But basically, you start at the top level, trying to, our ultimate goal is to control radionuclide release. There are various methods that you do that for various sources of radionuclides. You control radiation, you control the radiation itself, you control access to the radiation. Controlling radiation from the core is compared to processes and storage, controlling radiation and radiation transport versus direct radiation. So this is something that will be handled with something more like shielding and versus radiation transport from the core. And then you get into the various mechanisms for how you control transport. And these blue boxes here are ones we've denoted as sort of the minimum necessary in order to meet the offsite dose limits. And so when you get down to the bottom here, right, so we're focusing on controlling transport from the core, controlling radionuclides in the fuel particles, and really that's about maintaining particle integrity. That's governed by temperature, which is a balance between removing heat and generating it, and then also controlling chemical attack, and that really comes from the steam generator tube rupture accidents that can occur and moisture ingress events. So this is sort of the minimum set of functions that we have to meet in order to be able to guarantee that we can satisfy offsite dose limits. And then you use this in order to be able to select your safety related SSCs. So for the Xe-100, clearly controlling radionuclides and fuel particles, well, that's going to be the fuel particles. For removing core heat and controlling heat generation, on the control heat generation side, we're currently looking at relying on the inherent reactivity only, right? So we have control rods for the core, but our current claim is that we don't need to rely on them in order to be able to shut down the reactor safely. And then for removing core heat, we can remove it passively by conducting and radiating out of the vessel. And then for control chemical attack, it's really about minimizing the amount of water ingress that can occur in a tube rupture event. So there are various mechanisms to do that. So, that really comprises the totality of the safety related systems, right? So it's a very minimal set. That's the whole point. There are 4 or 5 different, safety related SSCs that we consider. And really that's kind of not the controversial piece of it. I would say it gets more complicated when we get to the NSRST part. The one thing I will note is that, while this is the minimum set of functions needed, that doesn't necessarily mean we're going to decide that that's all we're going to credit in the safety analysis. And I say that because, we can meet the dose limits by following this. But, there's a balance between, having margin during operation. It's really a margin management issue, right? As you credit fewer and fewer things, our doses, we can still meet the limits, but they're going to be higher than if you could credit certain things. But we may, it's possible to make a choice to say, well, I'm gonna V&V my tools to model these phenomena a little more explicitly, and I can take credit for them. That's going to reduce my doses. That's going to give me more margin in operations. It's going to cost me more upfront to do the V&V, but I'll gain more margin operationally. So this is minimally what you have to accomplish. But I would say that we've had a lot of discussions about where do we want to use the margin we have, and I would say that's an ongoing conversation. I would say where it gets more complicated is in NSRST. That's really, if I have to say where our day-to-day conversations, where we spend them, it's always talking about NSRST. Because, one, we have a very small set of safety-related components, and then within the 2 ways to get to NSRST, either by being risk significant or having, SSCs that are necessary to ensure adequate defense in depth, we're not currently predicting we're going to have any SSCs that are defined as risk significant. Everything is really going to be driven by ensuring adequate defense in depth. So that's really what drives most of our NSRST classifications. Let's see, just checking my notes. And yeah, I think that's good for that. And so with respect to the final piece of it, defense in depth, this, if you look at NEI 1804, it kind of breaks these 3 major pieces that I mentioned: selection of licensing basis events, SSC classification, evaluation of defense in depth adequacy. It looks like 3 processes. It's not 3 separate processes. They're clearly intertwined. But I think one of the things that we've learned going through this is that, as an organization, you have to build a process, right? And I think what I see these various pieces is tools that you have to put together in the right way in order to work for your design. And so, we spend a lot of our time talking about defense in depth because, again, I think the safety related piece is fairly clear. I think we have a good case for that. In NSRST, we're not identifying risk significant SSCs. And so really all the conversation is about defense in depth. And so, I would say our defense in depth adequacy and evaluation, it's really quite baked in with our SSC classification process. Because those are the major questions that we're asking all the time. So, we are looking at defense in depth on a regular basis, making sure that as we're making various classifications that our overall defense in depth posture makes sense. And so in the end, we'll probably run through the whole process to make sure, at the end that the posture is what we want it to be. But I would say it's something that we've found we're heavily integrating as part of the defense and the SSC classification process along the way. And the way we tie all this together, right? So the organizational way in which we go through this is we have within X-Energy what we call an NEI 1804 implementation team, which is the team that I coordinate. And then we also have what's known as an integrated decision-making process panel, an IDPP. And so the implementation team is the one that's working with the PRA team. The implementation team consists largely of folks on our licensing team and some folks on our PRA team. And so they're working to work with the rest of the PRA team, safety analysis team, pull together the information. I would say facilitate the conversation with the design team, because we try to really get our design teams heavily engaged in the process so that they buy into, some of the recommendations we're making on classifications and special treatments. And then that is put together in a package and reviewed by an independent panel, which is the IDPP, right? So they review it. They represent, operations, safety analysis, also represent PRA, system design, et cetera. And then they review and comment and approve the classifications and the special treatments that are recommended. And the way that we have sort of proceduralized it, or we haven't exactly proceduralized it because we produce guidance, but the IDPP was a charter established that identifies what the basic process is that X Energy is following to implement NEI 1804, and then various guidelines that give, to make sure that we implement it all in sort of a consistent way. So that's some of the, going through the various pieces of the process, and it's some I would say targeted things that we've learned along the way. Now kind of want to close off talking about some major insights and lessons learned. So one is, I think all of us, feel that the NEI 1804 process is a logically consistent framework to help establish all the pieces needed to make the licensing case. And one interesting story, so as people are probably aware, X Energy is involved in projects in Canada, and we had one of our Canadian counterparts, when they were first getting involved with the project, look at the NEI 1804 process, look at the Canadian process and the Canadian licensing structure, and they looked through it and said, yep, we have to do all of that. And this is put together in a framework that makes complete sense. So when someone sort of from a different licensing regime, different background came and looked at it, they said, this is something that makes a lot of sense. And even when we look at the Canadian licensing structure, expect it's something that can be, adapted or readily used. And as I mentioned before, the process, especially if you're building off of past designs, even leveraging, design insights from past designs helped us at the beginning getting risk insights into the design evolution. And so really it's, we can really use it along the way, as long as you can maintain the consistency of the PRA with the design, keeping things updated, we can really use it at all various, we found we could use it at all stages in design to draw appropriate insights. The performance-based framework, and it does also allow to readily implement other risk-informed initiatives. So some things that we found to be challenges. I would say that, you look at NEI 1804, it lays out a process and it talks about being iterative. How one does that iterative nature, I think that's really the art, is I think what we've seen. So at the early design stages, where do you begin? What's the right way to start? And also too, what's the right way you need to integrate it with your design process? Where does it involve? Where does it fall in your systems engineering management plan? Where does it fall in requirements management? And I'll say this: I think establishing a good protocol for requirements management early on within the context of this process is really important, because you have a lot of insights that are coming out of it. And system engineers, they speak in the language of requirements, right? And you need a good way to take the insights that are learned out of the process, vet them and factor them into requirements so that they can get communicated and get to the right place and get into the design. And it's a challenge to establish and maintain an iterative PRA model. It takes a lot of resources, and I would say even at the beginning, I would say it was not entirely clear, the level of resource that we needed, right? And I think that's a challenge, is predicting at the outset, how many people do I need? What kind of organization do I need in order to be able to implement this? In special treatment selection, the 5069 process, there's a lot common with the 5069 process, but not all of it translates. We've found some situations when that experience doesn't necessarily translate well, because bringing a lot of light water reactor mentalities over into the advanced reactor design, and you have to think a little bit differently. training and qualification of the IDPP team. So we have an IDPP, we need them to be smart on this whole process. Finding a lot of people who are smart on this process is hard to come by, right? So we need to get people trained. We need to bring more people into the fold. And usually you're having people doing double duty, serving on this team. So getting the right resources in place and getting them trained is really important. Couple different things to talk on. Kind of this last bullet, and then it gets down into the QA section, I think are really, really important. Developing a graded approach to quality assurance. I think a lot of us are used to, Appendix B and important to safety. There's really a new paradigm here and an opportunity to create a new paradigm and create a good graded approach to applying quality assurance. But it's not just with respect to safety. I think one of the things we've learned is also with respect to design phase. You have to be operating under some kind of quality management system, relatively early on, right? You need to have that in place, and there needs to be a basis for it. Using the approach to make, incremental steps towards building the full picture of QA requirements is really quite important. And one of the things I mentioned, we have, we're working in Canada as well, is that, if you, I don't know how familiar people are with the Canadian QA requirements, but, and as an American, I sort of naively went into this and thought, their requirements are laid out in N299, their N299 standard. And I sort of thought them as being the same thing as NQA1. Well, it's really not. N299 itself is a graded approach. And so, that's really quite different than NQA1. And so what we had to do is come up with an overall process to determine graded QA requirements that meet both US and Canadian expectations. And so that, I think, was a really good effort. And I would say we're road testing that process now, but it's graded not only with respect to importance to safety, but also allows us to phase it as a function of design so that the design teams can operate, they have justification for operating under a particular QA program all throughout the design process, and allows us to refine it along the way. Just a couple final things to touch on. I mentioned this a little bit, communication, integration with the design organization, and really having a good way of communicating requirements. Because again, we generate a lot of insight, you have discussions, that has to be formalized. And education on new terminology. Like I said, the number of times I've had to explain DBEs versus DBAs, well, I lost count, 9 months ago. So that's an important thing, to be able to try to get that terminology, get people understanding it. And then finally, as I mentioned, creating a single process, right? So I see NEI 1804 as a set of tools, and an organization is going to create their own process depending upon what's important to them. And just final on the last slide here, some few concluding remarks. Again, I mentioned the engagement in Canada, and I think we've seen a lot of positive movements. And I think there have been I think there was something recently issued by the NRC and the CNSC regarding, generally finding NEI 1804 acceptable. We know it's not an endorsement, but I think across our engagements there, we found that the NEI 1804 process has a lot of traction. And so really great potential there in being able to apply it across regulatory markets. And then also just one thing to close off on is the use of NEI 2107 for a SAR format. So that's something we haven't committed to, but we're actively looking into it since its release with the preparation of our own SARs. So with that, I thank you for your time and attention, and I will take any questions that you may have.
Okay, there's a question on the chat from Bob Martin.
Yes.
Can you read that, Kyle, or shall I?
Yes, I got it. So you stated that you only considered internal events. What have you done to address external events? So I'll say that first. So we have since started to incorporate external events in the PRA that was noted at the time. External events were not included, although I'd say we've been implicitly including them, at least in our thought process all along the way, because we know we're going to have to, even though it hasn't formally gotten into all aspects of the PRA yet. On the second item, for mechanistic source term calculations, did you use off-the-shelf codes? You develop it from scratch? And so that was the excess term code that I mentioned was an in-house developed code.
Okay, I don't see any other questions in the chat, but I had a question,
Yes, sir.
Kyle, on slide 14. If you go to that, yeah, there.
Yeah.
Uh, this idea of using figures of merit
Mhm.
as a means by which you can set decision-making criteria, right?
Yes.
That's how you use it.
Yep.
You say that you use dose and integrated risk, but how about you said a key part of this whole thing is margin management. How
Mhm.
about figures of merit associated with margins at different levels in the hierarchy of the requirements? Have you thought about that?
I would say we've not formally. I mean, I think that we've had conversations about margin management, but I would say have not yet incorporated that into our thinking as of yet. Most of what we've been looking at in some of these figures of merit have to do with how we set importance relative to establishing QA requirements. That's kind of what we've been focusing on so far. The margin management discussions, I would say, are ongoing, but we haven't made decisions yet with regards to how that's going to be explicitly incorporated.
Let's see, there have been a couple of other questions. Perhaps you can pick up on them because
Yes,
they're coming rather fast right now, all of
sure.
a sudden.
So let me look at, first question from, all right, so thank you for the presentation. I do have two questions. What was your screening criteria and how do you handle uncertainty? So I'll address the second first because I may need to ask you your follow-up on exactly what you mean on the first one. So handling uncertainty right now, so in the initial PRA, there was no explicit treatment of uncertainty, but we've developed uncertainty. We are developed and developing uncertainty quantification methods to be incorporated into the FC chart as we speak. So that's ongoing. And on the screening criteria, what is your? I can interpret that a couple different ways. What is your exact meaning there?
Perhaps the person can go off of the chat and off of mute, and you can state your question if you wish.
For sure. Hello, can you
Yes.
hear me?
Yes, sir.
My name is Egemen. I mean, for the screening criteria, we have many internal events or initiating events. You pick some of them. I think you have some screening criteria not to include other initiating events.
Sure.
That's what I mean.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure, I understand. So I probably can't give the best answer to that. The PRA folks working could probably do better than me. What I'll say is that we're using the ASME non-light water reactor PRA standard, and my understanding of that standard is that it has a methodology in there for screening screening what events you have to consider, and we're following that process.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's see, there are a couple of other questions. One from Eric Osterley.
Yes. So in the column on dose, you indicated M or P for various event sequences. Oh, so that's kind of a holdover from that old phase 0 PRA because it's when the doses were originally developed, both I think it was the MHTGR and PBMR were used as the dose, as the source of the dose information. So it was indicating whether or not it was the MHTGR, I believe, or the PBMR source terms where that was based upon. But it was basically the source of the dose information that was used.
Next, Andrew Clark, for the PRA model, are you relying strictly on absolute risk metrics, or are you leveraging some relative risk metrics?
We're using both. And in different circumstances, but both, yes.
Then Mark Joseph, perhaps you can read it. You know?
Sure, yeah, I'll take care of it, yeah.
Yeah.
So question on use of 1E-4 limit for design basis compared to use of 1E-6 as limit for DOE reactors. Is the use of 1E-4 based on a standard or expected to be accepted by the NRC? So, you know, the 1E-4 for DBEs, you know, this was what was laid out in NEI 1804 and my understanding endorsed as part of Reg Guide 1.233. So that's my understanding, is that those categorizations have been accepted by the NRC.
Yeah, I don't know if you want to discuss that anymore, but it seems like a pretty significant change. I'm just not familiar with the use of 1E-4 versus 6. I mean, I agree with the -4 because you know, there's certain design basis events that are based on E-4. However, beyond design basis is pretty much, you know, E-6.
Yeah, I will admit that I cannot comment very well on that because, I mean, I would speak to those who may have been involved in the process in developing NEI 1804. I can't comment on what the basis behind that was, unfortunately.
So
Okay.
there's the next question from Bob Martin. Perhaps you can address that.
Yep. So a key challenge for applying NEI 1804 to a first-of-a-kind designs, there's no design-specific operating experience to draw frequency and reliability data from. Using the limited data from the few HTGRs that have been built and operating would seem to be very out of date, although an argument could be made that data would be conservative. How have you gone about justifying the data you used to populate the PRA models? No, it's a great question. And actually it was a sentiment that I wanted to touch on, but didn't. You know, I think, you know, we use the data, the best available data that we have. You know, some of that comes from, you know, available sources in the industry now. And some of it might come from, you know, I don't honestly know what data the PRA team is using that might come from, you know, the past HTGRs. But, you know, essentially we have to recognize that there's uncertainty and try to make decisions commensurate with that uncertainty. And so I would say, you know, we use the best information that we have, try to understand what the key importance drivers are and understand, you know, if that thing is important, but it's using values that we think have a lot of uncertainty associated with it, then we have to adjust our decision making appropriately. That's a very probably confusing answer because it's very situation specific. But I think it's the idea of looking at, okay, I need to make a decision. All right, what information is available to make that decision, and how confident am I in it? And we sort of make that judgment as those things come up. And if we find that there's not a lot of basis behind the numbers that we're using in a certain circumstance, then we either have to take an action to go get more information, or you know, or you know, build in margin or something, right? So it's hard for me to answer generically because it's a very situation specific thing. So
next question from Jarrett Valeri.
Yes.
Physical security scenarios?
At present, no. The physical security scenarios have not been yet considered.
See, and I think there is a comment from Bob Martin that the 1E-4 comes from a DOE document.
Yes, the 1E-4 comes from DOE Handbook 1224, I believe, is what Bob says.
Okay, that's great. So, okay, one more question. I guess we still have 5 minutes, so go ahead.
Yeah.
I'll let
Yeah,
you.
so NEI 1804 has 3 categories for LBEs: AOOs, design basis. Yeah, I think looks like it's a follow-on to the comments of the AOOs, design basis events greater than 1E-4, and beyond design basis events that goes from 1E-4 to 1E-7. All 3 are considered in the LMP process. Great, thank you for clarifying, Mustafa.
Okay, that's great. Kyle, you handled quite a number of questions. If people have any more questions, you know, and you're able to enter it into the chat before we close off, we do try to limit this community of practice session to 1 hour, because we find that's what people plan for, and we don't want to impose on their time more than they plan for. But again, Kyle, I want to thank you very much, for coming forward and making this presentation. I think it has clarified a lot of ideas about NEI 1804, which, it can get to be pretty complicated. And as you look at specific applications, it becomes a little more clear. So anyway, thank you again very much. And please thank X-Energy for supporting you in this work. And we at ANS appreciate that very
Certainly.
much.
Thank you, Prasad, and thanks all of you for your attention and